29. The world forgot how to end. It did not explode. It did not burn. It simply grew very, very tired, and the tiredness spread like warm milk across every surface until the edges of things softened and the clocks gave up counting. Streets sagged. Streetlights dimmed to the color of old honey. Even the moon looked embarrassed, hanging low and heavy, as though someone had asked it to stay up past its bedtime, and it had politely agreed. You felt it first in your knees, a pleasant, treacherous heaviness that said, "Sit down, little one. Nothing matters now." You were on the roof of the apartment building you had lived in for 7 years, without ever learning the names of your neighbors. The city below you exhaled a long, slow, breathy sigh that smelled of rain on hot asphalt and distant bakeries, closing for the night. Every window glowed the same sleepy amber. Every curtain swayed like a slow dancer who had forgotten the song, but kept moving anyway. You lay back on the tar paper still, warm from the day's vanished sun, and let the tiredness pour into you the way melted wax fills a mold. Your thoughts, usually sharp and quarrelsome, rounded themselves off and drifted downward like snow that had decided falling was easier than staying aloft. Somewhere far away, a siren sang itself hoarse and then curled up to sleep mid-wail. A single taxi rolled to a stop in the middle of an intersection, headlights dimming to candle flames, driver resting his forehead on the wheel as though the car itself had become a cradle. You closed your eyes for what you thought was a second. When you opened them again, the city had slipped its skin. The buildings were still there, but gentler now, built from something between brick and dream stuff. Their windows breathed. Vines of soft grey moss climbed the walls and flowered with tiny lanterns, no bigger than fireflies, each lantern holding one slow pulse of rose gold light. The streets had turned to packed wool, springy and warm underfoot. Overhead, the sky was a deep indigo quilt stitched with constellations that rearranged themselves into lullabies. You could almost hear the stars humming, a low choral note that vibrated in the hollows behind your ears. Your body felt wrapped in cashmere made of gravity. You stood, though standing felt optional, and discovered your shadow had grown plush and rabbit soft. It followed you reluctantly, yawning. A voice, not quite sound and not quite thought, brushed against the inside of your skull. "Welcome, late waker. You are in the Hypnogogia. Everything here is almost asleep, but not quite. Nothing here will harm you. Nothing here will rush you. Time has taken off its shoes and lies down wherever it pleases." You took one step, and the Wall Street rippled like a pond skimmed by a lazy breeze. Another step, and a memory you didn't know you still owned floated up. The smell of your grandmother's kitchen after she had baked bread, and then napped in the rocking chair with flour still on her cheek. The memory settled over your shoulders like a shawl. Ahead, where the avenue used to be, a river now flowed uphill in slow motion. Its water was the color of midnight tea with too much milk. Small paper boats drifted on it, carried single candles that never quite went out. Instead, they burned softer and softer until they became fireflies and lifted away. On the far bank, though far had lost its urgency, stood a forest of enormous dandelion clocks, each seed head the size of a house. Every few minutes, one of them released a puff of glowing down that rose, turned into a sheep made of cloud, and wandered off bleating in a voice like distant thunder muffled by pillows. You walked toward the river because walking felt like being carried. Your feet made no sound. The air tasted of chamomile and warm electrical storms. At the water's edge waited a ferry that was also a bed. It was a four-poster carved from driftwood, the color of sleep itself. Mattress thick with eider down. Sheets the pale blue of 3M skies. Pillows were heaped like offerings. A figure stood at the foot of the bed holding a long pole of polished moonlight. The figure wore a robe woven from owl feathers and twilight. and where its face should have been there drifted a slow galaxy of silver moths. Going across? The ferryman asked without opening a mouth. You nodded, though nodding felt like allowing your head to be cradled. You climbed in. The mattress exhaled a sigh of perfect contentment and adjusted itself to every curve you had ever worried about. The ferryman pushed off with the pole, and the bed glided forward as though the river were greased with dreams. Halfway across, the ferryman spoke again, voice soft as moth wings on glass. Most people fight the heaviness at first. They think if they fall all the way asleep here, they will never wake up in the world they know. But the secret is, the world they know is already dreaming them. You can visit either place whenever you like, provided you are not afraid to close your eyes. You closed your eyes because the ferryman had made it sound like the most natural thing. The darkness behind your eyelids was not empty. It was furnished. There were velvet armchairs and a fireplace made of slow-burning stars. Somewhere a grandfather clock ticked in 9/8 time, the rhythm of a heartbeat learning to waltz. When you opened them again, the bed fairy had docked beneath a tree whose trunk was a spiral staircase of roots and whose leaves were pages from every bedtime story ever told. The pages turned themselves in a wind that smelled of vanilla and cedar. Small glowing creatures that might have been commas or might have been fireflies perched along the branches, blinking in Morse code that translated to hush, hush, hush. The ferryman offered a hand gloved in moonlight. You took it and stepped onto a path paved with the soft undersides of clouds. Each footfall released a faint scent of the last place you felt entirely safe as a child. The path led into a valley where the ground was one vast quilt stitched from the blankets of everyone who had ever fallen asleep happy. The stitches glowed faintly. Here and there, corners of the quilt lifted as sleepers beneath turned over, and you glimpsed glimpses of their dreams. A child riding a bicycle made of birthday cake. An old man dancing with his wife who had died 20 years earlier. A cat the size of a continent purring up mountains of cream. At the center of the valley stood a pavilion made entirely of breath yours, perhaps or everyone's. Its pillars were slow exhalations that condensed into marble veined with pearl. Its roof was a single held inhale, translucent and trembling. Inside, on a dais of compacted lullabies, rested the source of the great sleepiness. An immense hourglass filled not with sand, but with warm milk. The milk fell in one continuous silk ribbon from the upper bulb to the lower. Yet the upper bulb never emptied, and the lower never filled. Time and milk had reached an understanding. Around the hourglass sat 12 guardians, each the embodiment of a different flavor of sleep. There was heavy-limbed sleep, fast and gentle as a sleeping bear. There was drifting sleep, who floated 3 inches above the ground and left a trail of goose down. There was fever sleep, flushed and restless, tossing on a couch of cool moss. There was the sleep of new lovers, tangled and smiling even with eyes closed. There was grief sleep, hollow-cheeked but peaceful at last. There was the short, bright nap that arrives on buses and in lectures, cheeks pressed to windows or desks. Each guardian wore a crown of whatever the sleeper had been, dreaming of when they were most deeply asleep. They turned toward you as you entered, and their gazes were softer than anything that had ever looked at you before. One of them, you thought it was the guardian of childhood sleep, who looked about 9 years old and also ancient, beckoned. You were late, the child said kindly. We started without you, but there's always room. A place had been saved for you on a cushion woven from your own forgotten dreams, the ones about flying, the ones where everyone you loved was in the same room laughing, the ones where you were small again and someone carried you upstairs because your legs were too tired. You sat. The cushion knew exactly how much support your back needed and gave it without being asked. The guardians began to sing, not with voices but with the sounds things make just before sleep. The creak of floorboards settling, The last page of a book closing. Rain tapering to a whisper on the roof. A kettle clicking off. A dog sighing as it circles 3 times and lies down. The sounds braided together into a chord that pressed gently against your sternum and said, "Let go." You let go. You fell. But it was the kind of falling that happens inside a hug. You fell through layers of yourself you had carried like armor. The part that worried about money. The part that rehearsed conversations that never happened. The part that stayed braced for bad news. Each layer peeled away softly, painlessly, and drifted off to be laundered in moonlight. Eventually you reached the bottom of yourself, the softest part, the part that had never been afraid in its life because it had never been separate from anything else. It was a small child version of you curled inside the ribcage of an enormous benevolent animal, perhaps a whale, perhaps the night itself that floated through an ocean of warm black ink. The child you opened one eye, recognized the animal, and went immediately back to sleep, smiling. You stayed there a long while, or no while at all. When you rose again, if rising is the word, the guardians were gone. The pavilion was gone. The valley was gone. You were lying on your back on the roof where you had started, except the tar paper had become moss and the city lights were now fireflies, and the moon had pulled a comforter of cloud up to its chin. Your body felt rearranged, as though someone had taken it apart and put it back together, with fewer edges and more padding. You were not awake in the old sharp way, nor were you asleep in the old helpless way. You were something in between, a twilight citizen. The voice that was not quite a voice returned, closer now, intimate as breath against the inside of your air. You may stay here forever if you like. Nothing will ask you for anything ever again. Or you may take a single drop of this sleepiness back with you, enough to soften the world you left. Most people choose the drop. They are afraid that if they stay, they will forget how to want things, how to hurt, how to be entirely human. But wanting and hurting are only loud because the world is loud. Here, they are quiet. You would not lose them. They would simply learn to speak in bedtime voices. You thought about it over, or felt it over, the way one feels whether a blanket is heavy enough. You chose the drop, a single bead of warm milk, condensed on the tip of your finger, the same milk from the endless hourglass. It glowed faintly, like a pearl that had learned luminescence from moons. You touched it to your lips. It tasted of every good night you had ever had, multiplied. Instantly, the roof mask became tar paper again. The fireflies became streetlights. The comforter clouds parted to show the old familiar moon, thinner now and more wakeful. The city noises returned, but they arrived swaddled, as though traffic still hissed. It hissed the way waves do when they have decided not to wake the sleeper on the sand. Sirens wailed, but in a minor key that apologized for disturbing you. You stood. Your knees were still soft, but they carried you. You walked to the roof door, down 7 flights of stairs that creaked companionably, through the lobby where the night doorman was dozing with a small smile, out onto the sidewalk that was once again concrete, but now felt forgiving. The drop of sleepiness lived under your tongue like a secret lozenge. Whenever the world shot,